The idea was supposed to be a joke, something spoken between laughter and half-empty glasses on a quiet Friday night, the kind of careless sentence that floats into the air and disappears without consequence. But when Arif first said, "What if we swapped lives for a while?" neither he nor Rafi understood that he wasn't really talking about jobs or routines or the small frustrations they often complained about. And perhaps that was the problem with best friends who had known each other for too long. They learned to hide their truths inside humor, disguising their deepest exhaustion behind smiles that fooled everyone, even themselves. They had been inseparable since university. Two young men who had once believed their futures would unfold side by side in perfect symmetry, and in many ways, they had. They both married within the same year. Both built careers that looked respectable from the outside. Both bought homes not far from each other. Both settled into lives that appeared stable and complete. But stability is not the same as fulfillment, and completeness is often an illusion maintained for the comfort of others. Arif's wife, Nabila, was quiet and observant, the kind of woman who noticed everything but spoke only when necessary, and Rafi's wife, Samira, was warm and expressive, her laughter filling rooms with ease, and for years their four lives intertwined naturally. Shared dinners, shared holidays, shared histories that blurred the boundaries between friendship and family, until one evening something shifted, something none of them could fully explain. It began subtly, as most life-altering changes do, with absence rather than presence, with the things left unsaid rather than the things spoken. And Arif began to notice the distance in his own home, the silence between himself and Nabila that had grown so gradually he hadn't realized it was there until he found himself sitting across from her at dinner with nothing to say. Their conversations reduced to logistics and routine, and he told himself this was normal, that marriage inevitably softened into quiet companionship. But deep inside, he felt a loneliness he could not name. Rafi, meanwhile, lived in a house filled with noise and affection, yet even he carried a quiet burden, one he never voiced, because Samira loved him with an intensity that made him feel both grateful and undeserving, and he wondered sometimes if love could also be a kind of debt, something he was constantly trying and failing to repay. The night everything began, they were sitting together after dinner, the wives in the kitchen talking softly, while the two men remained at the table, nursing their drinks and their thoughts. And Arif said it lightly, almost carelessly. "Do you ever wonder if we chose the right lives?" And Rafi laughed at first, dismissing it as philosophy born from fatigue. But Arif didn't laugh, and there was something in his expression, something fragile and exposed that made Rafi pause. "What do you mean?" he asked. And Arif hesitated before answering, as if afraid of his own honesty. And then he said, "I mean, do you ever think about what it would be like to live differently? Even just for a moment?" Rafi didn't answer immediately, because he did think about it. More often than he admitted. But he had always buried those thoughts beneath responsibility, beneath gratitude, beneath the belief that wanting something different was the same as betraying what he already had. Over time, the idea returned in fragments, mentioned in passing, half serious and half not, until it became something unspoken but understood, a shared curiosity neither of them fully acknowledged. It was Samira who first gave the idea form, though she didn't realize it at the time, when she mentioned how exhausting it was to always be the strong one, the supportive one, the one who carried everyone else's emotions without ever setting them down. And Rafi listened with concern but also confusion, because he had never seen her strength as a burden, only as part of who she was, and he realized then how little he understood about the sacrifices she made silently. Nabila, too, carried sacrifices, though hers were quieter, hidden beneath her calm exterior, and Arif had grown so accustomed to her steadiness that he had stopped seeing the effort it required, stopped noticing the way she adapted herself around him, reshaping her own desires to fit the life they shared. The truth was, none of them fully saw one another anymore. Not completely, not honestly, because familiarity creates blindness as easily as it creates comfort. The suggestion, when it finally came, was spoken cautiously, tentatively, as if afraid of its own existence. And it was framed not as an exchange of people, but as an exchange of perspective, a temporary rearrangement of routines, of roles, of proximity, a chance to understand each other's lives from the inside rather than the outside. And they all laughed when it was first said aloud, laughed because it sounded absurd, because it threatened the fragile stability they depended on. But beneath the laughter was something else, something real and dangerous and compelling. They told themselves it would be harmless, that it would change nothing, that it was only an experiment in empathy, a way to rediscover gratitude for what they already had. But experiments have a way of revealing truths no one is prepared to face. The first night was the hardest, not because anything dramatic happened, but because of the quiet, the unfamiliar silence of sleeping in a different space. Beside someone whose breathing followed a different rhythm, whose presence reminded them constantly that something fundamental had shifted, and Arif lay awake staring at the ceiling, aware of Samira's presence beside him, aware of the invisible boundaries between them. And he realized with sudden clarity how long it had been since he had truly seen anyone clearly, including himself. Across the city, Rafi sat in the dim light of Arif's living room, watching Nabila read, her expression calm and distant, and he felt an unexpected sense of peace in her silence, a peace that contrasted sharply with the noise inside his own mind, and he wondered how many parts of his life he had overlooked simply because they were familiar. None of them spoke openly about what they were feeling, not yet because some truths require time before they can be faced. But already, beneath the surface, something was unfolding, something irreversible, because when you step outside the life you have always known, even briefly, you begin to see it differently. And once you see clearly, you can never fully return to blindness. What none of them understood yet was that this exchange would not only reveal hidden dissatisfactions, but hidden sacrifices, the quiet compromises each of them had made in the name of love, the parts of themselves they had given away without realizing the cost. And by the time they understood the full weight of what they had uncovered, nothing between them would ever be the same again. The morning after the exchange arrived with a strange stillness, the kind that made ordinary sounds feel louder than they should have been. The ticking of the clock in Arif's hallway, the quiet clink of a spoon against ceramic as Samira stirred her tea in his kitchen, and he watched her from across the room with the uneasy awareness of someone witnessing a version of life that did not belong to him yet was unfolding around him anyway. And neither of them spoke at first, not because there was nothing to say but because there was too much, and language felt insufficient to hold it. Samira moved with a familiarity that was not truly familiarity but adaptation. Her hands careful, her posture slightly tense, and Arif realized that comfort is not defined by space, but by belonging. And this space, his space, did not belong to her no matter how gently she tried to inhabit it. He noticed the small differences immediately, the way she opened the curtains wider than Nabila ever did, letting sunlight flood into the room with an openness that felt almost intrusive. The way she hummed under her breath without realizing it, filling the silence he had grown used to with something alive and unrestrained. And he found himself wondering how many sounds he had stopped hearing in his own home simply because they had never existed there. Across the city, Rafi experienced something entirely different, because Nabila's presence did not alter the atmosphere of Arif's house with noise or movement, but with stillness. A stillness so complete it felt deliberate, and she sat across from him at the dining table, reading quietly, her tea untouched, and he felt an unfamiliar pressure to speak, to break the silence, because her quiet demanded awareness in a way Samira's warmth never had. "Did you sleep well?" he asked finally, and she looked up at him with calm eyes that revealed nothing and everything at once, and she nodded once, a small, sufficient answer, and he realized that he did not know how to exist inside silence without trying to escape it. The hours passed slowly for all of them, each moment stretching with awareness, with observation, with the subtle discomfort of proximity to unfamiliar truths. And yet beneath the discomfort was something else, something quieter and more dangerous. Understanding. Arif began to notice the invisible weight Samira carried, the way she checked her phone frequently, not out of distraction, but responsibility, responding to messages from her family, from colleagues, from people who depended on her presence and reassurance. And he realized how much of her life was spent supporting others, holding together structures no one else even saw. And he wondered if Rafi understood the extent of it, if he appreciated the constant effort required to be the person everyone relied on. Samira, in turn, noticed the absence inside Arif's home, the lack of personal traces beyond functionality, the minimal decoration, the careful order. And she felt an unexpected sadness, because a home reflects the emotional life of those within it, and this home reflected restraint, control, and quiet endurance. She found herself asking questions she had never asked before. Questions about Nabila, about Arif, about the shape of their marriage, and she realized she knew less than she thought. Rafi's experience with Nabila revealed something even more unsettling, because her silence was not emptiness, but containment, and as the day unfolded, he began to see the effort behind it, the constant awareness, the careful observation, the emotional labor of anticipating needs before they were spoken, and he understood, perhaps for the first time, that silence can be its own form of sacrifice, the sacrifice of voice, of expression, of presence. They spoke little, but when they did, their conversations carried a weight unfamiliar to both of them, stripped of the casual ease he shared with Samira, and replaced by something more deliberate, more revealing. "Are you happy?" he asked her once, the question escaping before he could stop it, and she looked at him for a long moment before answering, and when she did, her voice was calm but distant, as if the answer existed somewhere far beyond the room. "I am content," she said, and he understood immediately that contentment is not the same as happiness. That evening, when they all gathered again briefly, the air between them had changed in ways none of them could articulate, their glances lingering a moment too long, their smiles slightly uncertain, because they had begun to see things they could not unsee, and empathy, once awakened, cannot easily be silenced. Arif noticed the way Rafi looked at Nabila with new awareness, and Samira noticed the way Arif watched her when he thought she wasn't looking, not with desire but with recognition. And beneath it all was the growing realization that this experiment was no longer theoretical, it was real, and it was uncovering truths none of them had been prepared to face. That night, as they returned once again to their temporary arrangements, each of them carried with them a quiet and irreversible shift in perception, because they had begun to understand that love is not defined only by presence but by sacrifice, and sacrifice, once revealed, changes everything. The confession did not come suddenly, but formed slowly, like condensation gathering on glass, invisible until it reached a point where it could no longer remain contained. And it was Rafi who spoke first, though he did not intend to. Though the words escaped him with the quiet inevitability of truth that has waited too long. It happened late at night, when the city had softened into silence and the distance between people felt smaller, and he and Nabila sat in the dim living room, the only light coming from a lamp in the corner, its glow warm but insufficient to hide the tension in his posture. She had been reading again, her presence calm and undemanding, and he realized with growing discomfort that her silence made space for thoughts he had spent years avoiding, thoughts about himself, about his marriage, about the quiet exhaustion he carried but never acknowledged. "You don't ask for anything," he said suddenly, his voice low, almost uncertain. And she looked up slowly, her expression unreadable. "What do you mean?" she asked, and he struggled to explain, because the realization was still forming even as he spoke it. "You just accept things. You don't argue, you don't complain, you adjust." She held his gaze for a moment, and he saw something flicker there, something fragile and long buried, and for the first time since he had known her, she did not look calm. "Adjustment is not the same as acceptance," she said quietly, and her words settled heavily in the space between them. He felt an unexpected tightness in his chest, because he understood what she meant even before she explained it, and he realized how often people confuse silence with peace. "Then why do you do it?" he asked, not accusing but genuinely confused, and she hesitated, as if weighing the cost of honesty. "Because sometimes maintaining something requires you to disappear inside it," she said, and her voice did not break, but he could feel the fracture beneath it. Across the city, Arif was experiencing his own unraveling, though his came not from silence but from presence, from the steady warmth of Samira's openness, from the way she asked questions he had never been asked before, not about work or responsibilities, but about himself, about what he wanted, about whether he was happy. No one had asked him that in years, not even Nabila. And he realized with quiet guilt that he had never asked her either. They sat on opposite sides of the couch, the television on but ignored, because the real conversation was unfolding in the space between them. "You seem tired," she said gently. And he laughed softly, not because it was funny, but because it was true. "I think I've been tired for a long time," he admitted, and saying it aloud made it real in a way he could not undo. She didn't respond immediately, and he appreciated that, appreciated her willingness to let his words exist without trying to fix them. "Do you love her?" she asked finally. And the question struck him with unexpected force, not because it was inappropriate, but because he didn't know how to answer it honestly. He did love Nabila. He knew that. But love, he realized, had changed shape over time, softened into something quieter, something less visible, and he wondered if love could survive without being expressed. "I don't know if she knows I do," he said, and the confession surprised him even as he spoke it. Samira looked at him with something like sadness, not for him, but for both of them, because she understood then that marriages do not break suddenly. They erode slowly, through absence rather than conflict, through words left unsaid and emotions left unshared. That night, none of them slept easily, because awareness is a restless companion, and once it arrives, it refuses to leave quietly. Rafi lay awake thinking about Samira, about her laughter, about the emotional weight she carried without complaint, and he realized with painful clarity how much he had taken her strength for granted, how often he had leaned on her without asking what she needed in return. Arif lay awake thinking about Nabila, about her silence, about the possibility that her quiet had never been peace, but sacrifice. And he felt a growing unease, the unsettling awareness that he might not know his own wife at all. And Nabila and Samira, in their separate spaces, carried their own realizations, their own long-suppressed truths rising slowly to the surface. Because this exchange had done more than rearrange their physical lives, it had rearranged their emotional ones, and with each passing hour, the fragile structures they had built around themselves were beginning to crack, revealing the hidden sacrifices that had held everything together for far longer than anyone realized. The truth emerged not as an explosion, but as a release. Quiet and irreversible, and it was Samira who finally spoke it, though she had carried it inside herself for years, carefully hidden beneath her warmth and her constant effort to be everything everyone needed. And it happened on the last night of the exchange, when the weight of unspoken understanding had grown too heavy to ignore any longer. She and Rafi sat together in the dim kitchen, the same kitchen where she had spent countless evenings cooking meals, smiling easily, asking about his day even when her own had left her exhausted. And now she sat across from him not as the version of herself he had always known, but as someone unguarded, someone standing at the fragile edge of honesty. He had been watching her differently since the exchange began, not with suspicion, but with awareness. And she could feel it, feel the shift in his attention, the way he noticed the pauses in her speech, the tension in her hands, the quiet moments when her smile faded before she realized it. "There's something I never told you," she said finally, her voice steady but softer than usual, and he felt his chest tighten, not with fear, but with the recognition that this moment mattered. She hesitated only briefly before continuing, because hesitation had been her habit for too long, and she was tired of it. "I gave up things," she said simply. And he frowned slightly, not because he didn't believe her, but because he didn't understand the scale of what she meant. "We all give up things," he said gently, trying to reassure her, but she shook her head. "No," she said, her eyes holding his now, clear and unflinching. "I gave up parts of myself." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning, and she saw the confusion in his expression, the slow realization forming as he began to understand. "I had opportunities," she continued. "Work I wanted to do, places I wanted to go, versions of my life that existed before I chose this one. And I told myself it was love, that choosing us meant letting those things go. And I never blamed you for it. I never even told you, because I wanted you to feel secure. I wanted you to build your life without worrying about what it cost me." Rafi felt something inside him fracture as he listened, because he had never asked her to give those things up, but he had never asked her not to either, and he realized then that sacrifice does not require permission. It only requires silence. Across the city, Arif was hearing something equally difficult from Nabila, though her words came slower, shaped by years of restraint. They sat facing one another in the quiet living room, the exchange nearly over, and she looked at him not with accusation, but with calm clarity. "I stopped being visible," she said, and he did not interrupt, because he knew she needed to finish. "Not because you asked me to," she added, "but because I believed it was the only way to keep peace, the only way to make sure nothing broke, and I told myself that stability was enough, that love did not need to be loud to exist." He felt shame rise inside him, sharp and undeniable, because he had accepted her silence without question, had allowed her to disappear inside their life together without realizing what it meant. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked quietly, and she gave a small, sad smile. "Because I didn't think you would see it," she said, and he understood then that her sacrifice had not only been in what she gave up, but in her belief that it would never be recognized. When the exchange ended and they all returned to their own homes, nothing looked different. The furniture remained in the same places, the walls unchanged, the routines waiting patiently to resume. But inside each of them, something fundamental had shifted, something that could not be undone. Rafi looked at Samira with new eyes, not seeing her strength as something endless and effortless, but as something chosen, something that came with cost. And he understood now that love requires not only receiving sacrifice, but acknowledging it. Arif looked at Nabila and saw her not as quiet, but as someone who had learned to survive inside silence. And he realized that loving her meant making space for her to exist fully again. And Samira and Nabila, in their own ways, began to reclaim the parts of themselves they had set aside, not by abandoning their marriages, but by stepping back into visibility, by allowing their voices to be heard without fear of disruption. The experiment they had once treated as curiosity had revealed something far more important: that love cannot survive on sacrifice alone, that sacrifice without recognition becomes erasure, and erasure, if left unchallenged, becomes loss. They did not separate, they did not abandon one another, but they did something more difficult. They chose to see one another honestly, without the comfort of illusion. And in doing so, they discovered that the true exchange had never been of wives or routines, but of perspective. And perspective, once gained, reshapes everything. In the end, their lives did not become easier, but they became truer. And truth, unlike sacrifice, does not require anyone to disappear in order to survive.